This recorded lecture will be going over Chapter 8, the muscular system. In a 120-pound person, about 50 pounds is skeletal muscle. This is known as the red meat of the body that is attached to our bones. Muscular movement occurs when chemical energy from nutrient molecules is converted into the mechanical energy that powers the movement of protein filaments with muscle fibers. This movement causes muscles to contract. As the muscle fibers in a muscle contract, they pull on the bones to which they are attached and therefore produce movement of the body. We have three types of muscle tissue: skeletal muscle, cardiac muscle, and smooth muscle, also known as involuntary muscle. They all function and specialize in contraction or shortening of the muscle. This image can be seen on page 152, showing the different types of muscle tissue as well as their locations within the body. Under the microscope, thread-like cylindrical skeletal muscle cells will appear in bundles. They are characterized by many crosswise stripes and multiple nuclei. Each fine thread is a muscle cell known as a muscle fiber. Skeletal muscle tissue has three names. It can be known as skeletal muscle because it attaches to bone, striated muscle due to its cross stripes or striations, and voluntary muscle because its contractions can be controlled voluntarily. In addition to skeletal muscle, the body also contains two other types of muscle tissue: cardiac muscle and smooth muscle. The bulk of our heart is made up of cardiac muscle. Fibers within this type of muscle tissue are also cylindrical, but they branch frequently and then merge into a connected mass of interconnected tissue, almost as though they were woven together in a basket. Very similar to skeletal muscle fibers, cardiac muscle fibers have cross striations. Under a microscope, they have dark staining bands that are cross-sections of the intercalated discs, where the plasma membranes of adjacent cardiac fibers contact one another. Cardiac muscle is considered involuntary because we cannot control its contraction to any great extent. Smooth muscle fibers are tapered at each end and have a single nucleus. Because they lack cross stripes or striations, they are also sometimes called non-striated muscle fibers. They have a smooth appearance. They are called involuntary because we normally don't have control over these contractions. Smooth or involuntary muscle forms an important part of the walls of our blood vessels and many of our hollow internal organs or viscera, like the gut, urethra, and ureters. Because of this location found in many visceral structures, it can also be known as visceral muscle. These contractions are highly regulated even though we cannot control them. A skeletal muscle is an organ composed mainly of skeletal muscle fibers and connective tissue. Fibrous connective tissue wraps around each individual muscle fiber and continues as it wraps around groups of muscle fibers known as fascicles. It will then form a wrapper around the entire muscle organ. Fascia is the loose connective tissue outside the muscle organs that forms a flexible, sticky packing material between the muscles, bones, and the skin. Most skeletal muscles will attach to two bones that have a movable joint in between them. In other words, most muscles will extend from one bone across a joint to another bone. One of these two bones is typically more stationary during a given movement than the other one is. The muscle's attachment to the more stationary bone is called its origin, and its attachment to the more movable bone is known as the muscle's insertion. The rest of the muscle, all of it except for these two ends that we just mentioned, are known as the body of the muscle. Tendons will anchor muscles firmly to bones and are made of dense fibrous connective tissue that extends from the muscle wrappers we described earlier. In the shape of heavy cords or broad sheets, tendons will have great strength. They will not tear or pull away from bone easily. Small fluid-filled sacs called bursae will lie between some tendons and the bones beneath them. These small connective tissue sacs are lined with synovial membrane, which secretes a slippery, lubricating fluid known as synovial fluid that fills the bursae. Like a small, flexible cushion, a bursa will reduce friction and make it easier for a tendon to slide over a bone when the tendon's muscle shortens. Tendon sheaths will enclose some tendons. Because these tube-shaped structures are also lined with the synovial membrane and are moistened with synovial fluid, they, like the bursae, will facilitate body movement. This image can be seen on page 152, showing the attachments of a skeletal muscle. Skeletal muscle tissue consists of elongated contractile cells, or muscle fibers, that appear as long tube-like cylinders. Their flexible connective tissue wrappings will hold them together in parallel groups, allowing individual muscle fibers to pull together in the same direction, like a team. The fiber's internal framework is organized into many long cylinders, each made up of two types of thread-like microfilaments, known as thick and thin myofilaments. The thick myofilaments are formed from a protein known as myosin, and the thin myofilaments are composed mainly of the protein actin. Skeletal muscle tissue consists of elongated contractile cells, or muscle fibers, that appear as long tube-like cylinders. On page 153, in image C at the very bottom of the page, find the label that says sarcomere. Think of a sarcomere as the basic functional or contractile unit of skeletal muscle. The submicroscopic structure of a sarcomere consists of numerous thick and thin filaments arranged so that when they are viewed under a microscope, the dark and light stripes or cross striations can be seen. The repeating units or sarcomeres will be separated from each other by dark bands known as Z-lines or Z-discs. Note the contraction of the muscle in figure 8.3. On page 154. This type causes two types of myofilaments to slide towards each other, which then shortens the sarcomere and therefore the entire muscle. When a muscle is relaxed, the sarcomeres will remain at their resting length and the filaments maintain their resting portions. And this image is on page 153. An explanation of how a skeletal muscle contracts is provided by the sliding filament model. According to this model, during contraction, the thick and thin myofilaments in a muscle fiber first attach to one another by forming cross bridges that then act as levers or to ratchet or pull the myofilaments past each other. The connecting bridges between these myofilaments will form only if calcium is present. In the relaxed state, calcium ions will be stored within the smooth endoplasmic reticulum in the muscle cell. When a nerve signal stimulates the muscle fiber, the endoplasmic reticulum will release calcium into the cytoplasm. There, these calcium ions bind to the small blocking proteins associated with the thin filament fibers and permit actin to interact with myosin. The contraction process of a muscle cell requires energy, and this energy is supplied by glucose and other nutrients. The energy must be transferred to myosin heads by adenosine triphosphate, or ATP molecules, our energy transfer molecules of the cell. Oxygen is required to efficiently transfer energy to ATP and to make large amounts available to the myosin heads. It is therefore not surprising that many of our muscles have high oxygen requirements. In addition to the oxygen carried to muscle fibers by hemoglobin within the blood, muscle fibers also contain myoglobin, a red oxygen-storing pigment similar to hemoglobin. During rest, oxygen from the blood is stored in the myoglobin found within muscle fibers. Because contracting muscles require large amounts of oxygen, the combined contributions of hemoglobin and myoglobin will promote the maximum recharging of our energy-containing ATP molecules. This diagram is on page 154, showing the muscle contraction mechanism. The functions of our muscular system are many. The system produces movement of the skeleton and permits us to move our entire body as well as individual limbs. By producing continuous tension on our skeleton, known as muscle tone, this system will also help maintain a stable body position or posture. Skeletal muscles also produce heat and therefore help maintain our homeostatic balance of body temperature. Muscles will move bones by pulling on them. Because the length of a skeletal muscle can shorten as its fibers contract, the bones to which the muscle attaches will move closer together. As a rule, only the insertion bone moves. As the muscle body contracts, shortens, and pulls on the insertion bone toward the origin bone, the ball is lifted. The origin bone will remain stationary while the insertion bone moves towards it. Remember this simple rule: a muscle's insertion bone moves towards its origin bone. It's also important to remember that muscles can also produce tension as they extend. This will occur when muscles lengthen under tension as the muscle insertion is pulled by a load away from the origin. Tension during muscle lengthening can often be called eccentric contraction. Voluntary muscle movement is normally smooth and free of jerks and tremors because skeletal muscles work together in coordinated teams rather than individually. Several muscles will contract while others relax, producing almost any movement that you can imagine. Of all the muscles contracting simultaneously, the one that is mainly responsible for producing a particular movement is known as the prime mover for that movement. The other muscles that will help in producing the movement are known as synergist muscles. As prime movers and synergist muscles relax at a joint contract, other muscles known as the antagonist muscles will relax. When antagonist muscles contract, they produce movement opposite to that of the prime movers and the prime movers' synergist muscles. We are able to maintain our body position due to a continuous low-strength muscle contraction known as muscle tone or tonic contraction. Because relatively few of a muscle fibers will shorten at one time in a tonic contraction, the muscle as a whole will not shorten and no movement occurs. Consequently, tonic contractions will not move any body parts. They do hold our muscles in position. Therefore, they maintain our posture. Good posture means that body parts are held in the positions that favor best function. These positions will balance the distribution of weight and put the least amount of strain on muscles, tendons, ligaments, and bones. Healthy survival depends on our ability to maintain a stable body temperature. A fever or elevation in body temperature of only a degree or two above normal is almost always a sign of illness. Just as serious as a fall in body temperature. Any decrease below normal is known as hypothermia. This drastically affects our cellular activity and normal body function. The contraction of muscle fibers will produce most of the heat required to maintain our body temperature. Energy required to produce a muscle contraction is obtained from ATP. Some of the energy transferred to ATP and released during a muscular contraction will be used to contract the muscle fibers. However, much of that energy is lost as heat during its transfer to ATP. This heat will help us maintain our body temperature at homeostasis. If muscle fibers are stimulated repeatedly without adequate periods of rest, the strength of the muscle contraction decreases, resulting in fatigue. If repeated stimulation occurs, the strength of the contraction continues to decrease, and eventually the muscle loses its ability to contract. During exercise, the small amount of stored ATP required for muscle contraction is quickly depleted. Formation of more ATP will result in the rapid consumption of oxygen and nutrients, often outstripping the ability of the muscle's blood supply to replenish them. When oxygen supplies run low, the muscle fibers will switch to a type of energy conversion that does not require oxygen. This process produces lactic acid, which could contribute to a burning sensation found in muscles during exercise. The simple term oxygen debt describes the continually increasing metabolism that must occur in a cell to remove the excess lactic acid that accumulates during prolonged exercise. Labored breathing after the cessation of exercise is required to pay the debt of oxygen required for the metabolic effort. Muscles will not function alone. Other structures like bones and joints must function along with them. Most skeletal muscles will only cause movements by pulling on bones across movable joints. The respiratory, circulatory, nervous, muscular, and skeletal systems will all play essential roles in producing normal movements. The skeletal system disorders, especially arthritis, will have disabling effects on our body movement. Muscle function then depends on the functioning of many other parts of the body. The normal function of one part depends on the normal function of other parts. Before a skeletal muscle can contract and move a bone, the muscle must first be stimulated by nerve impulses. Muscle fibers are stimulated by a nerve cell called a motor neuron. Any single motor neuron can stimulate more than one muscle fiber. However, each muscle fiber will communicate with only one motor neuron. The point of contact between the nerve ending and the muscle fiber is known as the neuromuscular junction. Signal chemicals called neurotransmitters are released by the motor neuron in response to a nerve impulse. The type of neurotransmitter operating in each neuromuscular junction is called acetylcholine. The released acetylcholine moves across the neuromuscular junction and triggers events within the muscle fiber, resulting in its contraction. A single motor neuron with the muscle fibers it innervates is known as a motor unit. In our bodies, we have small and large motor units. In a small motor unit, a given motor neuron will control only a few muscle fibers. These are common in the eye muscles and can offer precise control. In large motor units, a given motor neuron will control hundreds, maybe even thousands of muscle fibers. These are commonly found in the thigh and activated in high-intensity activities. And this image of a motor unit can be seen on page 157. In a laboratory setting, a single muscle fiber can be isolated and subjected to stimuli of varying intensities so that it can be studied. These experiments have shown that muscle fiber does not contract until an applied stimulus reaches a certain level of intensity. The minimal level of stimulation that is required to cause a fiber to contract is known as the threshold stimulus. When a muscle fiber is subjected to a threshold stimulus, it contracts completely. On the other hand, if a threshold stimulus is not reached, the muscle will not contract. Due to this, muscle fibers are said to respond in an all or none manner. A muscle is composed of many muscle fibers that are controlled by different motor units and all have different threshold stimulus levels. Although each muscle fiber in a muscle, like the biceps brachii, will respond when subjected to a threshold stimulus, the muscle as a whole will not. In addition to the tonic contraction of muscle that maintains our muscle tone and posture, there are other types of contraction that also occur. This includes a twitch contraction, tetanic contraction, isotonic contraction, and isometric contraction. A twitch is a quick, jerky response to a stimulus. These can be seen in isolated muscles during research, but usually play a minimal role in normal muscle activity. To accomplish the coordinated and fluid muscular movements needed for most daily tasks, muscles must contract in a coordinated, smooth, sustained way. Unlike a twitch, a tetanic contraction is more sustained and steady. It is produced by a series of stimuli bombarding the muscle in rapid succession. Contractions will blend together, producing a sustained contraction or tetanus. In most cases, isotonic contraction of muscle produces movement at a joint. With this type of contraction, the muscle changes length and the insertion end moves relative to the point of origin. There are two types of isotonic contractions. One is a concentric contraction in which the muscle shortens. The other is an eccentric contraction in which the muscle lengthens but still provides work. Walking, running, breathing, lifting, twisting, and most body movements are all examples of isotonic contractions. Contraction of a skeletal muscle does not always produce movement. Sometimes it increases the tension within a muscle without changing the length of the muscle. When the muscle contracts but no movement results, it is known as an isometric contraction. In other words, a muscle's length during an isometric contraction and during relaxation is about equal. Although the muscles do not shorten during isometric contractions, tension within them increases. Due to this, repeated isometric contractions will make muscles grow larger and stronger. And this is an image on page 158 showing the types of muscle contraction. Some of the benefits of regular, properly practiced exercise include improved muscle tone, better posture, more efficient heart and lung function, less fatigue, and looking and feeling better. Skeletal muscles will undergo changes that correspond to the amount of work that they normally do. During prolonged inactivity, muscles will typically shrink in a mass, a condition known as disuse atrophy. Exercise, on the other hand, will cause an increase in muscle size known as hypertrophy. Muscle hypertrophy can be enhanced by strength training. This involves contracting muscles against heavy resistance. Isometric exercises and weightlifting are common strength training activities. This type of training will result in an increased number of myofilaments in each of the muscle fibers. Endurance training, also known as aerobic training, does not usually result in muscle hypertrophy. Instead, this type of exercise program will increase a muscle's ability to sustain moderate exercise over a long period of time. Aerobic activities like running, bicycling, or other primarily isotonic movements will increase the number of blood vessels in a muscle without significantly increasing its size. This increased blood flow will allow a more efficient delivery of oxygen and glucose to be available to muscle fibers during exercise. Aerobic training also causes an increase in the number of mitochondria in muscle fibers, therefore allowing the production of more ATP, which will be needed to fuel prolonged activities. Various movements are produced by skeletal muscle contractions. Flexion is a movement that decreases the angle between two bones at their joint. Flexion is commonly described as a bending movement. If you bend your elbow or your knee, you flex it. Extension movements are the opposite of flexion. They increase the angle between two bones at their joint. Therefore, extension is a straightening or stretching movement rather than a bending movement. Abduction means moving a part away from the midline of the body, like moving your arm out to your side. Adduction refers to moving a part towards the midline, like bringing your arms down to your sides after they've been lifted. Rotation is movement around a longitudinal axis. You will rotate your head and neck by moving your skull from side to side, as in shaking your head no. Circumduction moves a part so that its distal end moves within a circle. When a pitcher winds up to throw a ball, she will circumduct her arm. Supination and pronation will refer to the hand positions that result from rotation of the forearm. Supination results in a hand position with the palm turned to the anterior position, as seen as in the anatomical position. And pronation occurs when you turn the palm of your hand so that it faces posteriorly. Some body parts, like the foot, can be difficult to describe with ordinary terms, so we use special terms to describe their unique movements. Dorsiflexion and plantar flexion will refer to ankle movements. In dorsiflexion, the dorsum, or top of the foot, is elevated with the toes pointing upward. In plantar flexion, the bottom of the foot is directed downward, as when you are standing on your toes. Inversion and eversion are also ankle movements. Inversion turns the ankle so that the bottom of the foot faces towards the midline of the body. Eversion turns the ankle in the opposite direction so that the bottom of the foot faces away from the midline of the body. This image describing flexion and extension of the elbow can be seen on page 160. And also on page 160, this image describes flexion and extension of the knee. On page 161, this is showing the examples of the other body movements that we just discussed. There are various skeletal muscle groups: muscles of the head and neck, on page 163, this image shows a general overview of the body's musculature, which we will next go into in more detail. The muscles of facial expression allow us to communicate many different emotions non-verbally. Contraction of the frontal muscle, for example, allows you to raise your eyebrows in surprise and furrow the skin of your forehead into a frown. The orbicularis oris, known as the kissing muscle, will pucker the lips. The zygomaticus elevates the corners of the mouth and lips and is called the smiling muscle. The muscles of mastication are responsible for closing the mouth and producing chewing movements. The term mastication, we know, refers to chewing. The two largest muscles of the group of the head and neck muscles are the masseter, which elevates the mandible, and the temporal, which assists the masseter in closing the jaw. The sternocleidomastoid and trapezius muscles are easily identified in figure 810 on page 163. The two sternocleidomastoid muscles are located on the anterior surface of the neck. They originate in the sternum and then pass up and cross the neck, inserting upon the mastoid process of the skull. Working together, they will flex the head on the chest. The triangular-shaped trapezius muscle forms the line from each shoulder to the neck on its posterior surface. When contracted, the trapezius muscles help to elevate the shoulders and extend the head backward. Each upper extremity is attached to the thorax by the fan-shaped pectoralis muscle, which covers the upper chest, and the latissimus dorsi muscle, which originates from structures over the lower back. Both of these muscles will insert on the humerus. The pectoralis major is a flexor, and the latissimus dorsi is an extensor of the arm. The deltoid muscle forms the thick, rounded prominence over the shoulder and arm. It has an origin on the scapula and clavicle and inserts on the humerus. It is a powerful abductor of the arm. The biceps brachii is a two-headed muscle that serves as a primary flexor for the forearm. It originates from the bones of the shoulder girdle and inserts on the radius in the forearm. The triceps brachii is on the posterior or back surface of the arm. The triceps is an extensor of the elbow and therefore performs a straightening function. The muscles of the anterior or front side of the abdomen are arranged in 3 layers, with the fibers in each layer running in different directions, kind of like the layers of wood in a sheet of plywood. The result of this is a very strong girdle of muscle that covers and supports the abdominal cavity and its internal organs. The 3 layers of muscle in the antolateral side of the abdominal walls are arranged as follows: the outermost layer or the external oblique, a middle layer or the internal oblique, and the innermost layer or the transversus abdominis. In addition to these sheet-like muscles, the band or strap-shaped rectus abdominis muscle runs down the midline of the abdomen from the thorax to the pubis. In addition to protecting the abdominal viscera, the rectus abdominis will flex the vertebral column. The respiratory muscles are discussed within Chapter 15. We have intercostal muscles that are located between the ribs and the sheet-like diaphragm, separating the thoracic and abdominal cavities. These will change the size and shape of the chest during breathing, and as a result of this, air is moved into or out of the lungs. The iliopsoas originates from deep within the pelvis and the lower vertebrae to insert on the lesser trochanter of the femur and capsule of the hip joint. It is generally classified as a flexor of the thigh and an important postural muscle that stabilizes the trunk, keeping it from falling backwards when you stand. The gluteus maximus forms the outer contour and much of the substance of the buttock. It is an important extensor of the thigh and supports the torso in the erect position. The adductor muscles originate on the bony pelvis and insert on the femur. They are located on the inner or medial sides of the thighs. These muscles will adduct the thighs or bring them together. The 3 hamstring muscles are known as the semimembranosus, semitendinosus, and biceps femoris. Acting together, they serve as powerful flexors of the leg. The quadriceps femoris muscle group covers the entire thigh. It covers the upper thigh. The 4 thigh muscles, the rectus femoris, and 3 vastus muscles will extend the leg. The tibialis anterior muscle is located on the anterior or front surface of the leg. It dorsiflexes the foot. The gastrocnemius is the primary calf muscle. It has 2 fleshy components arising from both sides of the femur. It will insert on the calcaneal tendon into the heel bone or calcaneus. The gastrocnemius is responsible for plantar flexion of the foot. A group of 3 muscles known as the fibularis group or peroneus group is found along the sides of the leg. As a group, these muscles will evert and plantar flex the foot. A long tendon from one component of this group, the fibularis longus muscle tendon, will form a support arch for the foot.